Thanks for coming. My name is Trudy Sandmeyer, and I am the director of the graduate program in heritage conservation here at USC. It is one of the 4 disciplines here in the School of Architecture, which includes architecture, landscape architecture, building science, and heritage conservation, which is the program that these students are a part of. We have a 2-year master's program, which is what I think everyone in the class is part of the master's program. And in addition, we have a certificate program, which is a shorter version for people who are interested in doing some professional development studies, and as well as a summer course in heritage conservation. This year will be our 23rd year of offering that course. It's a 3-week sort of boot camp about heritage conservation. We go all over the city and look at all kinds of interesting places and talk about a lot of the general issues involved in the field. So if you're interested, you can take a day, you can take a week, you can take all 3 weeks. But if you're interested in knowing a little bit more this summer, there's an opportunity to come and do a little studying with us here on campus. So thank you again for coming tonight. It's really nice to have a full house, and I'm really excited that the students are doing their final presentation for architecture class 554, which is advanced documentation. It's a heritage conservation practicum class, which means that they're actually doing a study of a real life thing, not just an abstract idea, but a real life neighborhood in this case. A couple of practical notes that you need to know. One is, if you wouldn't mind putting your cell phone on vibrate or silent, I would appreciate it, and I know the students would appreciate it as well. If you need to take a break and head for the restrooms, there's restrooms. If you go into the main hallway, the men's is to the left and the ladies is to the right. And yeah, anything else? I think that's the details. Okay, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about the broad context of this program and this class in the program. So this class is an opportunity for students to really delve deeper into the documentation of a place. In previous semesters, over the last 5 years, students have done archaeological fieldwork in Death Valley or taken an in-depth look at the stewardship of the National Historic Landmark Gamble House in Pasadena. For the survey practicum, we asked the students to go out and explore a different neighborhood in the Los Angeles metropolitan area. They learn all about the kinds of people who have lived and worked and played in a particular place, a particular part of the city, uncovering both the story of the architecture as well as something about the residents of the area. As an academic exercise, this class serves a variety of purposes for us. The class project usually results from a basic curiosity about a place. The exercise of discovery is always a useful one. Students learn how to think about place in terms of a broader context of the city and to see how buildings and sites they're looking at fit into the bigger picture. Students get out into a real neighborhood to look at buildings and sites, not in theory, but in reality. Students also look at the community through the lens of urban planning, transportation history, census research, development history, architecture, social history, etc., in order to better understand the unique story of a particular part of the city. Ultimately, what we know is that we're all stewards of our city, places that were here before us and will hopefully be here long after we're all gone. Layers of time and story exist all around us. I'm excited to hear the results of what the stories and the students uncovered tonight. So thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Trudy. My name is Katie Horek, and I am an adjunct lecturer here at USC. And these are my very, very hardworking students you'll be hearing tonight. So thank you so much for coming. It's really just such a treat to see so many community members from View Park in the audience. And I'd especially like to thank the View Park Conservancy, Ben Kale and Audrey Gaines, who really have been especially helpful in providing research and photographs and just general moral support to the students. So thank you very much. And of course, I'd like to thank the students who, of course, in addition to putting together this presentation and working on finals and working on their final project, they also found the time to put together this wonderful spread of refreshments for all of you. So thank you to you also. So as Trudy mentioned, the students who will be making this presentation are all candidates for our Master's of Heritage Conservation degree in USC School of Architecture. And each semester, an area is chosen as a case study, and students conduct an analysis of the area and study its eligibility for listing in the National Register, the California Register, or for local designation. I have personally known about View Park for a number of years in my work throughout Los Angeles County and have long admired the beautiful buildings in such a gorgeous setting. I also knew that a historic resources survey of the area had never been conducted. So when I was asked to teach this course by Trudy, it seemed the perfect opportunity for students to research the View Park neighborhood, discover its story, and study its buildings. Before this class, none of the students had been to View Park before, so this really was a process of discovery for everybody. And I don't want to give anything away, but I will say that the students found that View Park is not just a beautiful neighborhood, but also a place with a complex and fascinating history. So with that, I'd like to call up our first student speaker, Sandy Shannon, who will introduce the students' findings. Each student will introduce themselves as they come up to the stage. And just one note of housekeeping, we will be videotaping this presentation, so please do hold all of your questions and comments to the very end. And I'll call all the students up at that point and we can have questions and answers. But please hold everything to the very end of the presentation. So thank you. Sandy?
Hi, everybody. So I'm going to get us started today by talking about the area that we assessed in View Park and how we chose that area. So when we began this project, one of the first things that we did was to look up the tract records for the View Park Windsor Hills area to see who the developers were. And this is what we found. This area in pink was developed by the Los Angeles Investment Company, and the areas below by the Marlowe Burns Development Company and the Steinkamps, all of which were prominent developers in Los Angeles. We found that the investment company tracts had been historically advertised as View Park, and those tracts also had different characteristics than the surrounding tracts, so we knew to focus in on this area here. And this is actually what we do consider the boundary of View Park to be. Now, the problem with a View Park is that, as you can see, it contains more than 2,300 parcels, which is an enormous area to survey as a district. So we had to think about breaking this up into a more manageable task for this initial phase of the survey. So to help us inform where our survey boundary would be, we looked at the chronological development of the area. And we started by mapping the year in which the surrounding tracts were recorded. Areas in red, orange, and yellow were recorded in the 1920s, greens in the 1930s, and then the blues, the 40s, and the 50s. So this knowledge helped us zoom in on this area here, representing the earliest phase of development in View Park. And then driving around View Park, we realized that the oldest area, the area south of Angeles Vista in the reds, it has a different feel and features than the areas to the north in the hills, and the area is also less intact. So for that reason, we shifted our focus to this area, and that became our final survey area. So one thing that I want to point out is that you'll see that we included Angeles Vista in our survey area, even though it is part of the earlier tracts. And the reason we did that was because it is the major thoroughfare through the neighborhood, and also because visually it looks like the area to the north rather than the area to the south. So the next map shows the year in which each of the residences were built in our survey area. Red is 1920s, orange is 1930s, yellow 1940s, and green 1950s. So even though the tracts in our survey area were recorded in the 1920s, and most of the houses were constructed in the 1920s and the 1930s, development continued well into the 40s and even into the 50s. So we knew that we were going to encounter a wide cross-section of properties as a result. And then this is the last map I'm going to show you. So our survey area again, it's still a large area. There's 912 parcels there and only 7 of us. So for the purposes of this first assessment, we each evaluated 15 properties. And this last map shows the location of those properties in the survey area. So again, there are 7 groups of 15 parcels in various locations in the survey area for a total of 105 properties. So that concludes my introduction. My classmates are going to talk with you about what we learned regarding the history of View Park, and then I will return to talk about our summary of assessments and findings. And then, like Katie said, we'll conclude with your questions. So that being said, I'll turn it over to June.
Okay, good evening. My name is Junyoung Myung. I was assigned the early history of the View Park. So I want to explain about who lives in this area a long time ago, who owned this area, how the land was used before developing residence, how the city of Los Angeles was changed, who developed the View Park community, and what event was held in this area.
I need to speak up, Jim.
Okay, sorry.
Not that. Big word.
So View Park is located in the southwest of the downtown LA, and the community is placed on the hill. So I will introduce View Park timeline in chronological order. Briefly, the first known people to occupy the View Park area were the Gabrieliano Tongva Indians. In the beginning of the 1780s, El Pueblo was founded, and the concept of the rancho was developed this area. There were 3 main rancho in this area. E.J. Baldwin acquired the Rancho La Cienega. 1917s, the 1917s, the Inglewood oil field was discovered, and 1920, the Los Angeles Investment Company began to develop the View Park area. This area was used for Olympic Village in 1932. So this part is the Native American settlement. The large expanse of the Los Angeles Basin area was once inhabited by Native American of the Gabrieliano Tongva Indians. The Spanish government introduced the concept of the rancho system in 1784, which was a significant factor in terms of economical, social, and political influence. Many Spanish citizens received land grants in Southern California. So the population in Los Angeles and the number of the rancho rapidly increased during the 1820s. There were a variety of the rancho in terms of scale, quality of land, and size of labor force, and the number of the animals. There were many natural springs and marshland below the hill at Rancho La Cienega. The La Cienega is derived from the Spanish word cienega, which means the swamp or the marshland. The adobe house with the thick wall and the high redwood beam ceilings were once the center of the rancho. So next is the land use around the View Park. So this photo is the Baldwin's families. In 1875, Baldwin's purchased the half of the Rancho La Cienega for $35,000. In 1986, he acquired the rest of the areas for $60,000. After his death, Baldwin's daughter, Anita Baldwin, sold a large part of the rancho to the Los Angeles Invest Company. So this photo is Baldwin's areas. In 1880s land boom, E.J. Baldwin developed many towns in his own land, but the Rancho La Cienega remained largely undeveloped. At that time, it was not profitable real estate for development. So for this reason, this property was used for cattle or sheep ranching, planting for food, and managing a vineyard. In 1917s, the Inglewood of oil field of the Baldwin Hills Reservoir was discovered. So next is I want to show the annexation and the city growth of the city of Los Angeles. As a growing network of streetcar and railroad enabled the suburban development on the land outside of the historic center, the city boundary of Los Angeles began to be expanded through neighborhood territory annexation. So View Park is just about here. So in 1928, the residents of the View Park filed a petition with the city council asking for annexation to Los Angeles County. So during the 1930s, the subdivider was forced to turn to the Los Angeles for water supply. So of course he could not get this water supply unless the track would be annexed to the city. However, today the View Park is an unincorporated the city of Los Angeles. So next is early history of the Los Angeles Invest Company. As I mentioned earlier, Baldwin's daughter began the subdividing and selling part of Rancho La Cienega through the Los Angeles Invest Company. So Los Angeles Invest Company began to develop the residential real estate, mainly in undeveloped section of the city of Los Angeles. For this part of developer develop the process, next speaker will be present. Finally, the View Park was the location of the first Olympic Village for the modern Olympic Games in 1932. The main reason chosen the Olympic Village located in the View Park area was very close to Exposition Olympic Park and has lower temperature than any other places of city of Los Angeles. So the organizing committee of the Los Angeles adopted the Olympic Village plan that consists of the more than 500 Spanish colonial revival and the Tudor revival style cottage. And when the game was over, the village was removed and a dormitory building at the Olympic Village moved into the Elysian Park. Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, June. I'm Lynette, and I'm going to be presenting the research that we discovered for the developer and the development process between the years of 1923 in 1958. So some of this will be dovetailing with what June just presented to you. So part of what we do is we look at textbooks to give us guidance, and Virginia McAllister updated a field guide to American houses and included a section on how to read a neighborhood. And so the graphic that you see here are some of those elements that will affect a neighborhood. And I'm going to be covering the developer builder, the home financing, and the governance. And other speakers will be speaking to other elements. The National Trust also gives us guidance, and they have released a bulletin that talks about neighborhood developers and development in these different types of categories. So you're going to see the subdivider, the home builder, the community builder, the operative builder, and the merchant builder. And for Los Angeles Investment Company, what we found is they primarily fit under the heading of subdivider and home builder. And so what we're going to do is go through some of the elements of what that means in terms of acquiring, subdividing, improving the site, the infrastructure and the improvements that they've done. And then they do touch on some of the other elements in sort of a advanced, they were a little ahead of their time in terms of a developer, but they don't fully qualify as the other types of developers. So in the research, we found a number of advertisements. This is a page from a booklet from 1912 that talks about what the Los Angeles Investment Company does and what they have done up until the years 1912. They were primarily a real estate investment company, and so they bought and sold land and then developed it. But they were also part of the Los Angeles Stock Exchange, and so they sold stocks and they provided dividends, and they used some of their surplus to actually guarantee some of the loans. So they went a little bit beyond just being a developer. They also owned a lot of lumber yards and mills. So they founded in 1866. They were incorporated in California in 1899, and then they finally merged with their own subsidiary life insurance company called First Colony Life Insurance. So I found the actual documents in the Seaver Center Museum of Natural History in the research department, and so all of the county records for their corporation are there with all the minutes and everything. So who were these folks? They had the first set of, and the board of directors are up here, and they ran into a little bit of trouble. They were investigated for fraud in 1912, and so in 1913, the public decided that there was a lot of stockholders in the Los Angeles area and that this was too big of an investment for it to fail. So a lot of the community stepped forward, the business community, and headed and led the organization to refocus their efforts in trying to make it successful. What's important here is the people who stepped up. So you'll see down here, president was D.A. Hamburger, and that was a department store. You all know it now as the May Company. He went on to be the May Company. The vice president was R.A. Rowan, and he was a huge Los Angeles developer. He developed the Los Angeles Athletic Club, the Alexandria Hotel, and the Windsor Square residential development starting in 1911. So he had some influence. There was someone from the title company, and then most importantly, Los Angeles Times had Harry Chandler. And one thing about this particular area is that it's well documented. There are stacks and stacks of newspaper articles that were written, and one of the reasons I believe is because Harry Chandler was on the board. So you'll find a lot of documentation. So how do they go about developing this area? So you've already heard about the La Cienega area that took over, the rancher that they took over, and this is what it looks like and how they actually keyed it out in 1912. And one of the things that we found was that they had this lumber yard, and this doesn't exist today, obviously, but it was interesting that they kept the lumber yard going, and the economies of scale of buying lumber and then milling it and selling it using it in the homes at that time, all the way up until 1929, and probably a little bit beyond that. Another thing that they did was they decided to use deed restrictions and other types of mechanisms in order to unify the neighborhood. They were really looking to capitalize on the scenic views and other things that they could really find to draw people to buy homes in their area. I know it's hard for you to read, but we'll get some more detail here. So deed restrictions in terms of the built environment looks like this. So if there are no deed restrictions, because there was no zoning laws at the time, your houses would look a little bit more less organized, if you will. And so these are what deed restrictions can do. They set the setbacks, they talk about the different kinds of architecture that you can have, and they really create that homogeneous environment. The other thing the developer did was they developed the streets and the infrastructure. That means the utilities, the sidewalks, and the curbs. And this is the type of plan that you have in View Park, and it's it's most typical of that era. So where it all began, Sandy showed you a map and said 1923. This is the first home that we found when 1923 was built on this street, and there may be others, but this is one that we identified as being one of the first in 1923. So the other ways that they were developing is they were hiring professionals to talk about the name of the neighborhood. And so there's a lot of different names in the articles that you probably read in the Los Angeles Times, and they all have heights usually in the name. I'll get to it here, just a minute, because I wanted to read these to you. They were Los Angeles Vista Heights, Hilltop, View Terrace, Mesa Vista, and ultimately they honed in on View Park. And then they went back and they actually recaptured some of the tracks that they had named to other things to name them View Park. The other thing they had was an architectural service that had an overview of everything that was developed in the area. And this is really important in terms of context of the developer, because they had such oversight is the reason that you have such a unique and interesting area, unlike the neighboring areas that were developed by other developers. So this is an ad here that talks about all the things that they've done, and so I've retyped them here so you can actually read them. New access through an extended Santa Barbara, the underground utilities, the paved streets we've already talked about, the concrete walks, the location. They had schools that they talked about, transportation views, and they also staged model homes. And this was something that was going on during that time. They also ran a contest at one point, starting in 1933, where they decided to start telling architects and builders that if you came to View Park, we would give you $10,000, or they have the amounts down here, if you were selected as the best example of a house in the area. So they tried to create a little competition during that time. The other element was the FHA in 1934 was kicking in. So the National Housing Act provided government funding and enabled the area to be able to have FHA financing. And that was a big deal because up until this time, loans were all unsecured. It was very difficult to actually get a loan on a home. So let's talk, we're going to go a little bit back now to the Olympic, because this is a little bit about how they advertised the area. And so what we found in the research was that this backs up what June said, was that they leased the land, the Lucky Baldwins leased the land to the Olympic Committee, and then later developed it with the Los Angeles Investment Company. And part of that deal was that they had to return it without any marks on the land. So that's why you don't have any physical remnants left of the Olympics in your neighborhood, is that was part of the deal in terms of leasing it to them. And that's unfortunate. However, you do have some articles that talked about it, and this is what's left here. A lot of when the neighborhood was developed afterwards, they called it the Olympic Village section, and that's a property that I found in a news article, and so you can see that Vista de Oro was definitely part of that. And then the Olympic Village entrance, in terms of during the Olympics, you could see the Olympic Village is what they claimed through this gateway here, and that's where that starts. And then this is the home site test where they talk about being at the Olympic Village there. Just thought you might be interested in seeing that. The other thing that they did was they changed the street name. So in about 1938, Vernon Place became Olympiad. And the reason we discovered this was because there was an article with the names of people and places that I could not find. And so it led me to research even further what happened to this street, because it doesn't seem to be in the neighborhood even though they're calling it View Park. So in the city directories, I found that they had actually officially changed the name in 1938. So you might be looking for places that don't exist, and this will explain it. Another thing that doesn't exist but is interesting is that Los Angeles Investment Company also built some shopping centers that, well, in the context of a restaurant here. So they built this colonial revival, and it was Carl's Restaurant, and it was both a restaurant and a drive-in. And so that's something that's unusual in terms of a neighborhood having both a fine dining and a drive-in combined into one area. And I think that Scott's going to talk a little bit about the automobile culture and why that was probably a popular thing to have at the time. Here's a picture of the reverse side, which is the drive-in side, and you see the car, and you see these really tall windows, which is very typical of a coffee shop during that era, and the integrated signage here. That no longer exists, unfortunately. The other thing that was revealed was that there was a zoning change right in the middle of the neighborhood's development. So it started as an M3, which you see here in 39, and then you start to see that it goes to an R1 here. And that transition happened somewhere between June and December of 1947. I wasn't able to pull a lot of permits, but the ones that I was able to pull during that time period seem to show that distinction. Why that is unclear at this point. There was zone law in 1926 that enabled people to separate use between residential and industrial in America, and then there was in 1928 the ability to use deed restrictions in subdivisions, and in 1946 there was a Los Angeles zoning code that was put into place, but it didn't necessarily apply to the county. So there's more research that needs to be done here in terms of tying that together as to why that change happened. So the other thing we talked about earlier is deed restrictions in terms of the built environment. So I went to the end, which was 1958, to see how much control they had over the neighborhood until the last subdivision. And it turns out, despite the fact that there might have been zoning changes already happening, they continued to use declarations of restrictions to help shape the neighborhood, including this approval of plans for the builders. So they really did control everything until the very last subdivision. And the one thing I want to point out here is where the architectural committee actually resided. This was 3450 Mount Vernon. Some of you probably already know that address and what I'm about to show you. But these deed restrictions went to the year 2000. So they were not short-term deed restrictions in terms of how your properties were developed. So all roads point to this commercial building, which is one of the last commercial buildings, and I think the only commercial building that really falls within the boundaries of your district. And this is where people would submit, this is where the architectural committee had their office. And so this is an interesting, and it was built in 1945, so I think that it's a wonderful building to keep in your collection. Thank you, and Scott's going to tell you a little bit about the automobile culture.
Okay, good evening. My name is Scott Watson, and I will be talking to you about View Park as it relates to a change in suburbanization that happened at this time, moving from more of a streetcar to an automobile suburb. People don't often realize that transportation has a great impact on the way that the neighborhoods are designed, even how the houses are designed. And so hopefully by the end of my presentation, you'll be able to see that. So taking a step backwards, early suburbs were pretty much nodal cities. So you had the main city in the center, right here, and then you had a node that was the suburb. These were usually connected with a rail line, and the outer line suburbs would be centered around a transportation hub of some sort. In Los Angeles, some early suburbs are Lincoln Heights, which was the first one in 1870, Boyle Heights in 1876, and Angelino Heights in 1886. So these are some of the early suburbs in Los Angeles. Suburbanization took a major boom with the streetcar. And so this picture here is an example of what the streetcar suburbs, pretty much the idea behind it. You have the suburbs growing out along the streetcar lines as arms growing out from the central city here. So you almost get like a starfish-like pattern growing out from the city. In Los Angeles, some of the early streetcar suburbs begin in the 1890s, And this really began because in 1885, Los Angeles had the first successful electric streetcar. And this is a picture of the inaugural run of it. So right at this time period, we start seeing the streetcar pushing the city of Los Angeles outward. And at this time, there were several different streetcar companies until we have one guy come into play. Henry E. Huntington was very instrumental in creating the streetcars in Los Angeles. Two companies that he was involved in. First was the Los Angeles Railway, which he purchased in 1898 and began operation in 1901. Then you have the Pacific Electric Railway, which he established in 1901 and would later go on to sell it to the Southern Pacific Railroad. So with the Pacific Electric Railway, also known as the Red Car, that streetcar was primarily designed to connect the city of Los Angeles to the outer areas. So you see a lot of lines going down into Long Beach, out into Santa Monica, up into the San Fernando Valley, even way out into the Inland Empire. The Los Angeles Railway, on the other hand, also known as the Yellow Car, was really trying to connect the city of Los Angeles within itself. So you see quite a few lines, which don't show very well on this picture, and that was the idea was a transit within the city of Los Angeles. And it is very likely that the Los Angeles Railway was key into the location of View Park. If you see here in this map, you see Crenshaw Boulevard coming down here, 48th, Lemert, Angeles Vista. You see coming down Lemert and down Crenshaw, you see the 5 and the 6 lines. This map was in 1938, so by this point, View Park was already underway. But you also see the line. You also see the lines on the 48th and the 54th dead ending there at Crenshaw. So this area was a major transportation hub for the Los Angeles Railway. So it is very likely that View Park was established here at this location because of the easy access. So how does the streetcar affect the suburbs? There are several different ways. And if you look at this map here, you see Crenshaw coming down, Angeles Vista along here. You see the different properties are primarily rectilinear. They are smaller in size, creating a medium density. The streets are fairly straight. The idea was that people are going to be walking to the streetcar, so they needed a short, flat walk. So most of the time, the walk was no more than 10 minutes or so, 5 to 10 minutes. So properties were not usually built out more than 5 or 6 blocks. So these are the early parts of View Park, and so you very easily see the streetcar features of it. The next step is the automobile suburb, and this is when things really started to change for View Park. You see the automobile suburbs filling in the gaps in between those streetcar areas. In Los Angeles, 1920 was the decade of change, pretty much. There were 3 main things that happened that changed Los Angeles as far as suburbanization. One was the rise in the popularity of the automobile. Second was the major population boom that occurred during this decade. And third was a major push for decentralization by the city officials. And I'll talk about those in depth a little more. So with the rise in the automobile, in 1908, the Model T was introduced at a cost of $850. By 1925, the cost was reduced because of the assembly line process down to only $300. So quite a bit of change. At this time, we also see a rise in installment credits. So people were able to purchase their vehicle and make payments, much like we do today. Then an example of the rise in popularity is the number of registered vehicles in the county of Los Angeles. In 1919, there was 141,000 registered vehicles in the county. By 1929, 10 years later, there was 777,000. So an increase of more than 5 times. So there was a major increase in showing the popularity of the automobile. Second was the population boom. The 1920s, like I said, saw a major population boom in the city of Los Angeles. The population increased from 576,673 to 1,238,047. That's nearly doubling the population. Many of these people that came to Los Angeles were from the Midwest, and they had an idea of anti-urbanism. They liked their house, they liked their property, so they wanted a suburb so that they didn't have to live in the city. So that really kind of pushed that direction of the suburbanization. Then the third thing that I talked about was the move for decentralization. At this time, there were so many people in the city of Los Angeles. This picture here, taken sometime between 1910 and 1920, shows how much traffic and how crowded downtown Los Angeles was. A survey said that Los Angeles had some of the narrowest streets and probably close to double the amount of people moving into the city during the day than any other city in the survey. So the city officials needed to try and figure out a way to deal with this traffic problem. So they sought two different plans. One plan they sought beginning in 1924 was from Kelcourt, DeLue and Company. And that plan was a transit plan. It was a whole revamp of the transit system. So what do we do with the streetcars? If we get the streetcar off the streets, then there's more room for the cars. That plan created 26 miles of subway system, 85 miles of elevated light rail, and their plan was at a cost of $133 million. So for 1924 standards, that was a lot of money back then. The opposite plan, which began also in 1924, was the Major Street Traffic Plan created by the Olmsted, Bartholomew, and Cheney firm, which was a major city planning firm at this time. Their plan, on the other hand, was a push to decentralize, get the people out of the city, move outwards, and create highway systems. Their plan was proposed in the spring of 1924, voted on by November, and the people of Los Angeles approved that plan and even gave it $5 million in funding. So with that plan being approved by the end of 1924, by the time the other plan came out in 1925, they said, well, we already got a plan in action, so we'll just stick with what we had. So the other one died and didn't go anywhere. So how does the automobile affect the suburb? There's many character-defining features that are listed here. One is now the lots could be larger. They didn't have to be as small so that people had an easy walk to the streets, or to the streetcar. The streets also began to be more curvilinear rather than rectilinear. There was a hierarchical street plan, which means if you see here, I believe this is Angeles Vista right along here, and this is Mount Vernon right along the top. If you notice that those streets are quite wider than the others, and what that meant was those were the main thoroughfares. So the main car traffic will go through there, and they'd have to slow down as they go into the neighborhoods because the streets would narrow. So it was an idea of making places where people lived a little less traffic. The other part would be paved asphalt streets. They wanted the cars to have a smooth place to ride. Concrete sidewalks for the people to be able to walk. Curbs and gutters to get the water off of the streets. And also the parking strips to separate the public pedestrian from the street, because they didn't want them walking, the pedestrians walking right where the cars are going to be going. Give it a little bit of a buffer. So beyond the actual plan of a community, automobiles actually have influence on the way that the homes were designed as well. We see a rise in the prominence of the driveway and the garage. In this picture here, which you see a 4-car garage. In 1920s and 30s, that was unheard of, that anybody would have a 4-car garage. Most of the properties in View Park that we surveyed had at least a 2-car garage. So that even in itself was very uncommon. You see the driveway here in a prominent place. With the rise in the prominence of the garage and the driveway, what that did was it created that being the transition from the public to the private. So now, when people would come in, the driveway was the important part, and it reduced the size of the porches. If you look on this house here, the porch is nothing more than a setback or a recess about 3 feet or so. You don't see the large porches that you would see during the Craftsman era. And there were very few that we found in View Park that had any porch of that size. So View Park really represents a neighborhood that is in transition from the streetcar to the automobile suburb. And these different ads here exemplify it. This first ad is from 1926, talks about how to get to View Park. It's a very romanticized version of the motorist has to merely drive south on any street to West Vernon, 48th or 54th Street. And it really kind of makes it very romantic of how to get there by driving. But then right below it, but if you'd rather take streetcar, you just take the E-line. So this next ad in the middle, 1927, in this part right here, we see it talking about the different widenings of Angeles Vista and Mesa Verde. West Vernon, sorry. So talks about, once again, like I said, about the hierarchy of streets, the widening of those because they're the main thoroughfares. This bottom part here talks about the different street improvements, the paved streets, the concrete, sidewalks, the gutters, and so on. This last ad here in 1932, we see at the top picture, we see the transportation being highlighted, the public transit, but then we also see this map of how to get to View Park. And finally, in this corner, it actually tells us to drive to View Park. So these ads and everything I've showed you really kind of shows that View Park exemplifies an early automobile suburb, and that really was in transitional stage. So at this point, I will turn over to Kate.
Thanks, Scott. My name is Katie. I'm going to be telling you guys a little bit about the architecture we see in View Park. View Park is an excellent collection of period revival style architecture. Period revival architecture, if you're not familiar with it, is architecture that's influenced by previous architectural trends in history. So a lot of the time we see various types of period revival architecture throughout Los Angeles, and there's a great variety of it in the View Park neighborhood. So View Park in Southern California specifically did not have its own regional identity of period revival architecture until the late 19th century. So in 1893 at the Chicago World's Fair, the California building debuted in the mission style, which was regionally influenced by the, of course, Spanish missions, which dotted the California coast and the American Southwest. This style really set a trend for what became known as Western American architecture, and it was something that hadn't previously been identified with in the American Southwest, as the area was still developing and still gaining its own reputation in history. At this exhibition, Bernard Maybeck, a famous architect, especially in Southern California, said that this exhibition was truly made in California, and that it definitely resembled the architectural history of the region. Prior to the adaptation of mission-style architecture, California's buildings lacked a true regional style and were seen in all types of architectural styles popular throughout the United States in general. There were some period revival styles, which here for this postcard for Oakland, California, which was made in 1900. At the bottom, we can see some Gothic-style cathedrals, which were influenced by the Gothic revival style. But nothing in this postcard coming at the end of the 19th century really tells us about California's specific regional architectural style. The establishment of the mission style at the end of the of the century at the Chicago World's Fair really gave the West its first regional style, and soon these types of buildings were joined by newer contemporary architecture, including all types of other period revival designs. These types of styles gave California in the American Southwest an alluring reputation. Advertising to East Coast and Midwest residents, these types of gentle pasture images, like the one we see here in this magazine, were circulated, promoting the region with pictorial landscapes and mission motifs. Here in the top left corner, we can see a woman gently and romantically reading a book in front of a mission-style building. These mission motifs, like the one we see here, came to be associated with California's wild and undeveloped reputation, and became a trademark for the architectural styles which were synonymous with the region. It wasn't until 1915 when these buildings really came to precedent. These buildings spread widely in their association with California after the Panama Exposition at the San Diego World's Fair, which took place in that year. The buildings designed for this display used the mission elements in a more contemporary sense and adapted the various attributes known to the style to the various purposes of the buildings at the World's Fair. So this really demonstrated the flexibility of the mission style and how these various stylistic elements of the style could be adapted to various purposes of different types of buildings. The variety of Spanish-influenced buildings at this time really demonstrated these flexibilities, and it created a boom through Spanish colonial revival architecture that came shortly after. Just after the 1915 World's Fair, we start to see entire cities taking on this type of architectural style. So Ojai, which is located, of course, near Santa Barbara in California, was previously named Norhoff, and in 1916 changed its name and started adapting mission-style architecture. So here we can see a comparison of the same view. This postcard on the bottom is from 1917, and you can really see how this style was being adapted through all different kinds of architecture. On the left, we see a pedestrian walkway, which is in the mission style, and on the right, in the foreground, there's actually a commercial building, and in the back, with the bell tower, is a post office. So these buildings have remained, and here you can see that it definitely set precedent for how cities like this were completely redesigning themselves. This trend grew in popularity, and Spanish colonial revival architecture soon became the trend throughout Southern California. And here we start to see View Park. As everyone from city governments to celebrities like Charlie Chaplin were building homes and headquarters in the Spanish colonial revival style, its glamour and romanticization started spreading wildly. View Park was first subdivided, the region that we surveyed was first subdivided in 1923, and the Spanish colonial revival style homes we were looking at began construction in 1924. The last one that we looked at specifically in our homes we surveyed was in 1938, and other period revival styles continued to be built in View Park until the early 1940s. Advertisements like the one here emphasized the period of the architecture and linked it directly to the colonial past of the region. The Barcelona home was a popular advertising campaign that the Los Angeles Investment Company had taken on. They had numerous Spanish colonial style homes that they promoted as being affiliated with this type of romanticized interpretation of the region. Through historic photographs like this one here, we can compare the homes today to their previous construction and recognize the specific traits that contribute to their historic qualities. This one still communicates its Spanish colonial revival style through its arched windows and entryways and its clay tile roof, which is popular throughout the style. Other homes in the neighborhood contribute to the Spanish colonial revival style through other character-defining features, like large arched windows which face the street, clay tile roofs which are either hipped or gabled. This one here has a gabled roof which kind of is low in its pitch, and they typically have stucco cladding. We also see other elements that contribute to the style, like small exterior courtyards near the front doors, like we can see here in this photo. Another popular style we see in View Park is the Mediterranean Revival style. This style flourished in the region due to its romanticized interpretation and association with the climate of the Mediterranean region. These homes were described as luxurious and relaxing, and compared Southern California as a vacation destination suitable for everyday living and permanent residence. They're characterized by square plans like this one here, which is in a more box-type shape, and they typically have restrained porches that are small, with clay tile hipped roofs which come down on all four sides. Their decorative detailing is usually made of ironwork, like this home here, which has balconettes, and occasionally plasterwork, which we can also see in this home above the entryway. Another period revival style that we see in View Park is colonial revival, specifically American colonial revival. And these homes can be characterized by their symmetrical plans. They typically have shutters on one or both stories, and they have a pediment above the entryway in most cases. These revival styles were uniquely advertised by the Los Angeles Investment Company, kind of, what we perceive to be because, of course, the chairman of the board for the Los Angeles Investment Company was associated with the Los Angeles Times, like Lynette said. Many of the advertisements are seen specifically in that paper. And in this one, you can see Tudor revival homes being advertised through a series of posts. The Tudor revival homes in View Park they generally follow typical trends in the style, but have some unique qualities, like these towers, which we see here in this home. And these towers are popular in both the Spanish colonial revival and the Tudor revival homes in the neighborhood, but they differ in the way that they are connected to the houses and the way that they are roofed. In this one here, we can see a really steeply pitched roof on the tower in the center of the home, and a corresponding turret here in the front, which faces the street. These Chateauest towers are really character defining for the architectural style, and the other trademark feature of the style is decorative half timbering, which you can see here on this home in the back. So the most common period revival style that we see in View Park, of course, is the Spanish colonial revival style, which was absolutely booming in Los Angeles through the 1920s. Joined by other period revival styles, the Spanish designs recall the relaxing Southern California climate, and they compare View Park's convenient location and unbelievable views with those seen throughout the Mediterranean region.
Thank you, Kitty. My name is Osmar Alanis, and next we're going to be talking about architects, builders, and constructors. What we just learned from Katie is this area really has a significant amount of period revival architecture. So it pretty much begged the question, who were the architects? In terms of such a distinctive group of buildings, it was getting to a point where we had to decide why was there such an excellent, a huge amount of excellent architecture. So this became our endeavor. With any type of research into architects or builders, the most primary way of doing so is to research by permit. Now, as most of you here should know, this part of View Park is not in the city of Los Angeles. It's in the county. This meant that we had to go to the county Department of Public Works. This began as an initial issue because, as you see here, the Department of Public Works for the county did not begin or have an office before 1933. This record search request that we have here pretty much states that. So a lot of the houses that we have in your community, the unique ones began before that. So this already created an issue in terms of trying to find permits. When we did find permits, first of all, we had to work with the county, and the county was great in terms of trying to help us with their resources. However, through manpower issues and really the limitations that we would have as students, because we have to fit everything within a semester, the processing time has shrunk much more. So this was the type of, so that caused an issue in terms of processing and trying to find or get all of the permits that we needed. The next issue was with legibility. These are good examples of what we had to deal with. The one on the left is actually a good example an example of good readability in the papers that we received. And the right, it's a little bit more cloudy because of the age. With our luck, or as luck would have it, as you see the one on the left, where there was supposed to be architect information, that was just scratched out, and I'll get into that later. Effectively, it was because they felt that it was coming from the architectural department. So that made us move on to other resources. We as students have resources in terms of for research, with connection to different libraries, and then also just using the internet. And but what really helped us was the historic editorials. These editorials really started painting the picture of what was happening and when it was happening specifically. So we utilized the resources that we had with school, and it became very apparent that the Los Angeles Investment Company was the primary source of development and oversight in View Park. These are just examples of how the Los Angeles Investment Company was continually pounding and giving information of what was going on there, and a lot of those editorials like this are representing or informing people about your homes. The Los Angeles Investment Company was unique in that, for all intents and purposes, it was a one-stop shop, or it had its own architectural service. This was something that most companies and most developers did not have. So a lot of the architects were basically company employees. That's why when we saw the permit before, they pretty much just crossed it out because they were effectively saying it was an architect of Los Angeles Investment Company, and so it kind of gets lost to the ages. This just kind of shows that they just pretty much, and many times, pretty much, showed how important they were or how extravagant they were by having an actual architectural department. Just to pull you back a little bit and give you a slight history of the Los Angeles Investment Company. Before they got to View Park, they actually were tremendous developers of bungalows and cottages. One of the processes that we went through once the permit became a little bit more difficult was trying to find pattern books. And with the bungalows and cottages, we actually found quite a few pattern books from the Los Angeles Investment Company. However, when we started, that did not translate into the type of architecture, the period revival that we see in View Park. As I was getting to before, what it does show was that a system was created in terms of the type of structure that the Los Angeles Investment Company had, because they were so profound and developed their company through the development of bungalows and cottages. They actually developed a very unique system. To put it very plain and simple, they were a one-stop shop. They were their own development company. As we mentioned, they had their own architects, and they even went so far as having their own material or storing their own material. And then, of course, they went that last yard and built their own houses. So this illustration is unique in terms of it shows what the Los Angeles Investment Company did. But another aspect that it shows is you can see the different empty lots. And a lot of you, I know spoke to a few of you before we began, there was an extended period of time where there was empty lots in between. And that's important because what happened after that is we brought, there were other architects that came in and built, or owners that built themselves. The reality is that the Los Angeles Investment Company only built between 1932 and 1927. After that, they discontinued the architectural department. This article right here shows, we really couldn't get a solid date on when the architectural department ended, but we know by 1934 they're already showing that they're pretty much done with the architectural department. The one important part that they did continue to do is they held the oversight on the architecture. So individuals could bring on their architects or build by themselves, but they had to go through this architectural committee, if you will, to build in the area. Other architects that we're seeing, effectively people came in and bought lots, and they decided how they wanted to build. And these were the type of these were just a few names of the people that came in and actually built for themselves. But the one thing with the architectural oversight is you still continue with that cohesiveness in the neighborhood, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But this cohesiveness came through in the actual style, because they had to go through this architectural committee. The scale was the same. There was no, there weren't too many large houses built, or too, small lots maybe divided, and the setbacks remained the same. And so with all this, it created this cohesiveness that we still feel even today. So in closing, because of the architectural committees and really the history before they stopped building, the Los Angeles Investment Company just has a tremendous oversight on the development of View Park in your neighborhood.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mickey Torresgill, and I will be talking about restrictive housing practices and View Park as an ethnic enclave. By now, we've done a lot of talking about View Park's history as a subdivision, how it looks, and the resources that are there. So now let's talk about who was living there in its initial development and how that changed over time. Although View Park has remained an economically robust and vibrant neighborhood, it has not always had the ethnic diversity that it does today. Unfortunately, this part of View Park's history does not start off in a positive way and actually represents a darker chapter of Los Angeles' history. However, this part of the presentation will strive to show that although this history is filled with setbacks and obstructions, the African American community of View Park has succeeded in overcoming adversity, and this is truly noticeable in the community today. So starting in the late 1920s, View Park was strictly a whites-only development. This is because, like many Los Angeles neighborhoods, View Park had racially restrictive covenants in place when wealthy white residents began moving in. In these promotional photographs by Dick Whittington for the Los Angeles Investment Company to promote View Park, you can tell that the neighborhood was really designed as a middle to upper class whites-only area. So why did people want to live here? Well, in 1933, an organization called the Homeowners Loan Corporation introduced mortgage practices, which in turn initiated a practice of redlining residential security maps. Maps were coded with a certain color, which basically marked the level and extent of development. In short, where people would or would not want to live. This Google map is actually a modern-day representation of an original red line map. As you can see, the neighborhood of View Park is highlighted in green, right here. So now I'm going to walk you through the different color codes. Red areas were not desirable. They were characterized by an undesirable population or infiltration of it. Yellow areas were areas on their way to becoming red. They either had few or no restrictions on who could live in the area, and they were also characterized by inadequate transportation, insufficient utilities, heavy tax burdens, and poor maintenance. Blue areas were developed areas. Per the map code, they were, quote, like a 1935 automobile, still good, but not what the people are buying today who can afford a new one. Green areas like View Park in the 1930s were considered hot spots that were not fully built up. In nearly all instances, they were the new, well-planned sections of the city and almost synonymous with the areas where good mortgage lenders with available funds were willing to make their maximum loans. They were homogeneous and in demand as residential locations in good time or bad. So these areas were attractive to wealthy white homeowners. So the Los Angeles Investment Company controlled the homogeneity of View Park by placing racially restrictive covenants and language into the deeds signed by people moving into the neighborhood. So this is a little hard to read, so I'll read it for you. This is the exact language from the original deeds granted by the LA Investment Company. No persons except person of the Caucasian race shall be allowed to use or occupy said property or any part thereof, except in the capacity of domestic servants of the occupant thereof. I should note that this type of restrictive language in the deeds was not unique to View Park. Almost every neighborhood in Los Angeles at this time had restrictive covenants written into the homeowner deeds. And census records that we found backed up this statement by showing us that as of the 1930s, there were 2 black residents and 1 Japanese resident in View Park acting as servants. So this diagram is from the historic context statement for a nomination of historic resources associated with African Americans in Los Angeles, and it shows that in 1940, due to these racially restrictive covenants, African Americans were still concentrated in the Central Avenue corridor, just east of the 110 and south of the 10. During the war years, around 50,000 newcomers settled in this area and resulted in a lack of housing. Because so many neighborhoods were restricted to whites only, the black community was hit hard by this housing shortage, and they began to settle in areas outside of this corridor. So this is another diagram that shows where they started to settle. You can see a small group, let's see, Limerick Park? And then Baldwin Hills right there. So neighbors to View Park is where some of that community started to settle. These neighborhoods on the west side defied the racial border that had restricted blacks to the east side for so many years. Racially restrictive covenants were eventually declared illegal in 1948. However, the Los Angeles Investment Company still found ways to make it extremely difficult for African Americans to purchase homes in View Park. An article in the Los Angeles Sentinel in 1960 said, "From a reliable source, the Sentinel learned that when Negroes tried to purchase homes in this exclusive area, the prices jacked up $10,000 to $15,000 more than the house is worth. If the prospective Negro buyer agrees to this price, then the seller will usually want all cash. If the would-be buyer agrees to pay cash, the builder says this particular lending agency requires him to an agreement to sell to Negroes." Per the article, 9 out of every 10 African-American buyers had to find out-of-the-ordinary methods to fulfill his desires to own a home in View Park. Even the LA Investment Company deeds from 1958, this is language from the 1958 deed, this is a decade after racially restrictive covenants were struck down, still had language about racial restrictions on occupancy. This language reads, "No part of portion of said tract number 21687, which is subject to this declaration of restriction, shall ever at any time be used, occupied, or lived upon, or permitted to be used, occupied, or lived upon by any person not wholly of the Caucasian race, excepting that persons not of the Caucasian race may be kept thereon strictly in the capacity of a servant or employee, or servants or employees of a Caucasian owner or occupant." In an addendum of this later deed, the LA Investment Company notes that even if certain sections of the overall document are no longer relevant, such as this section, other sections could still be enforced. Presumably, the company knew and understood that racial restrictions were no longer allowed, but retained the language to assist with loopholes in selling to African Americans. Eventually, African Americans were able to move into the neighborhood. Some of the first, if not the first, Black residents in the neighborhood were Sisters Evangeline Woods Johnson and Ella Redmond in 1957. Unfortunately, they experienced threats, violence, and intimidation by groups of white neighbors. This was the final and most long-lasting mechanism of residential segregation in Los Angeles, and experienced by Black homeowners in many different neighborhoods. This fuzzy photo, is from a newspaper article explaining how the sisters found a cross burning in their front yard. Their home at 4025 Olympiad was partially burnt, but here's the home today. Fortunately, it was saved after the violence against it and now stands as a physical remnant of this enormous struggle from View Park's past. Oh, there, 45. Okay. I forgot I did that. Oh, what's going on? Okay. This behavior all changed in the 1960s, which is when the neighborhood of View Park reached the tipping point as more African Americans moved to the neighborhood. The tipping point is the level of integration at which whites no longer feel comfortable and wholesale flight begins. It is also when the minority population is between 25% and 40%. View Park reached the tipping point by 1965. By the 1970s, African Americans outnumbered Caucasians 3-1. This meant that of the existing 5,795 whites originally in the neighborhood, 4,000 had moved out. By the 1980s, the ratio had jumped to 9-1. A study in 1981 by the U.S. Census Bureau claimed that 2/3 of Black residents in the neighborhood were college educated, and professions ranged from business people to doctors. And View Park was eventually dubbed the Black Beverly Hills. Oh. Okay, sorry. I don't know how to use PowerPoint very well. So not only is this a predominantly African American area, it is an area of very prominent individuals and community leaders. Here's a photograph for the 1980s of an African American couple in front of their View Park home. View Park is unique in that minorities have been able to penetrate the formerly restricted neighborhood and maintain it as a successful and multicultural community. As you can see from this map, the circled area is View Park, and it shows that the area is still primarily African American. Although the African American population was originally met with intimidation and violence, it is now home to incredibly important leaders and holds a strong sense of community and history. The significance of the struggle for minority growth, specifically for African Americans, and the transition of View Park from a restricted neighborhood to an integrated one is solidified by the fact that the neighborhood continues to be a thriving Black community today. And I'll pass it back to Nancy.
Hi, I'm back. For those of you who walked in late, my name is Sandy Shannon. I gave the introduction earlier. Our goal is to determine if View Park meets eligibility criteria for National Register listing based on all the contexts and themes that my classmates have described. So to start, I will go ahead and tell you that we did determine that View Park is eligible for listing on the National Register. And I will explain to you why that is. So for those of you who are not familiar with the historic preservation process, I'll give you a little bit of Preservation 101. There are two different assessments that have to occur when evaluating a resource for National Register eligibility. The first assessment is the significance assessment, which is what it sounds like. Whatever is being evaluated, in this case our district, has to have some historical significance at the local, state, or national level. This assessment involves determining if there is an association between the place being evaluated and a set of significance criteria, which I will talk about later. And then also during this part of the process, you have to establish a period of significance. And properties that contribute to a historic district must relate to that period of significance. And then the second assessment that occurs is the integrity assessment. Integrity means to what extent has the district sustained alterations over the years. If it is relatively unaltered, we say that it has integrity. So, In order to be eligible for listing on the National Register, a district must have significance and it must retain sufficient integrity to convey its significance. So that is what we are looking for. So I will walk you through the significance assessment process. A district, in order to be eligible for listing on the National Register, must relate directly to one or more of these National Register criteria. So criterion A, a district can be significant under it if it is associated with important events that relate to broad patterns in history. A district can be significant under criterion B if it relates to the lives of important people in history. A district can be significant under criterion C if it has some sort of architectural significance, and that can mean several things, from being stylistically important to being important for its method of construction, or for being the work of a notable architect, for example. And then lastly, a district can be significant under criterion D if it has some sort of archaeological potential. And we found that View Park is significant under two criteria, criterion A, events, and criterion C, architecture. So under criterion A, events, we found that the district is significant in relation to three themes. First, automobile suburbanization. Second, developers and the development process. Third, restrictive housing practices and ethnic enclaves. So I'll walk you through each of those. Regarding the first theme, as Scott explained, the development of View Park occurred during a time in which automobile ownership was on the rise. View Park has physical characteristics that relate to this auto-oriented nature, and these features are associated with an important period of history in the U.S. during which the appearance and developmental patterns of communities reflected the rise of the automobile. Therefore, we found that View Park is significant under criterion A for its association with the theme automobile suburbanization. The next theme we determined to be significant was developers and the development process. So like Lynette explained, in the early 1900s, the population of Los Angeles increased tremendously and development occurred at a frenzied pace. Out of this grew powerful development companies with unique organizational structures and competitive marketing tactics. And View Park was developed by one such company, the Los Angeles Investment Company. And not only were they a key player in the Los Angeles real estate development scene at the time, but this was also an important development for them. The physical manifestations of the company's organization and strategies are evident in View Park, making View Park a significant representation of a residential neighborhood developed by an important development company to accommodate Los Angeles population growth during the first part of the 20th century. We also found that View Park is further significant under criterion A for its association with restrictive housing practices and as an ethnic enclave. Like Mickey explained, although many communities across the U.S. and Los Angeles had these restrictions in place, we found that View Park is unique in its ability to tell the story of the ability of early minority homeowners to overcome intimidation and adversity and to later create a thriving African American community in a formerly restricted neighborhood. So the events that occurred in View Park very well capture this complex chapter in American history. And so we found that the neighborhood is significant under criterion A for its representation of a pattern of history and events in which a formerly racially restricted neighborhood evolved into a vibrant African American community. And then under criterion C, we found that View Park is eligible under the theme period revival architecture. The residences developed in View Park during the 1920s and the 1930s reflect national and regional architectural trends. And in addition to being characteristic of major architectural patterns, due to the planning and long-term oversight by the Los Angeles Investment Company, the area has a unique and cohesive appearance that differs from other period revival residential developments of the time. So for these reasons, we found that it is significant under criterion C as a notable concentration of period revival residential architecture. And then the final theme that we explored was architects, designers, and builders. And although it is a beautiful and cohesive collection of buildings, we did not find that as a group it is associated with the work of notable architects, designers, or builders. The architects who worked for the Los Angeles Investment Company were mostly not notable, and the architects who later worked for individuals building their own homes. Although there were some significant architects involved as a group, there were not notable architects involved in the development of the neighborhood. So we did not find that View Park is significant under this theme, which means that it is not a theme that we moved forward with in our assessment. So, since View Park is significant for its association with criterion A and criterion C of the National Register, the next thing we had to consider was the period of significance. The period of significance refers to the span of time during which significant events and activities occurred in View Park. And first, when you do this, you have to establish a period of significance for each theme, and then from there, you can develop an overall period of significance. So I will walk you through our periods of significance. So 1923 reflects the year in which the first tracks were developed by the Los Angeles Investment Company in View Park, thereby initiating the construction of the neighborhood into an automobile-oriented suburb with period revival architecture. So 1923 is the start date for our first three themes. And then for period revival architecture, the end date there is 1938. And that marks the year by which period revival architecture had essentially stopped being constructed in our survey area of View Park. 1945 is the end date for automobile suburbanization, and that is the year by which residential development patterns had shifted to reflect the expansion of the highway systems, and we started seeing a different kind of suburbs being developed. And then 1958 is the end dates for developers in the development process, and that very simply marks the year in which the last tracks were developed by the Los Angeles Investment Company in View Park. And then with regards to restrictive housing practices and ethnic enclave, the start date there is 1957, which is the year in which the first known African American homeowners moved into View Park. And then 1965 is the end date there, which reflects the year by which it was considered a thriving African American community. So that gives us our overall period of significance, which is 1923 to 1965. It encompasses all of our periods of significance and reflects the year in which development began and the year by which it was a thriving African American community. So we have established that View Park is significant under the National Register criteria, and it has a period of significance from 1923 to 1965. The next thing that we had to look at was, does it retain sufficient integrity to convey its significance? So there are 7 aspects of integrity that must be considered when evaluating a district for National Register consideration. And they are location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. And one thing to point out, a district need not maintain all 7 aspects of integrity to be considered eligible for the National Register. However, significant integrity must remain to convey the area's significance. That being said, however, we did find that as a whole, the district does retain these 7 aspects of integrity. We found that although there are some buildings that have been altered over time and there has been some recent infill, the district retains the original features established by the Los Angeles Investment Company during the period of significance, both in terms of individual residences and then also community features. And as evidence of the integrity of the neighborhood is the number of residences that contribute to the district. So in a historic district, you have contributing residences and non-contributing residences, which I will explain more about what that means in a bit. But first I'll show you a map of residences we determined to be contributors and non-contributors in our survey area. So 86% of our properties that we assessed, we found to be contributors, and that means 14% then would be non-contributors. One thing that I will point out is that the National Register does not require that a certain amount of properties be contributors, just enough so that the district conveys its significance. But we can say that 86% is a pretty high number for a district. So here are some photos of contributing residences, just to give you an example. Contributors were constructed during the period of significance. They relate to the historical context of the neighborhood, and they retain most, if not all, of their integrity. And then buildings that were identified as non-contributors, they were done so for one of three reasons. The first reason being that some residences were not visible from the public right-of-way, so if they can't be seen, they therefore cannot contribute to the district. The second reason a property was identified as a non-contributor was because it was constructed outside the period of significance. And then the last reason a property would be identified as a non-contributor would be because it has sustained significant alterations that occurred outside our period of significance. And common alterations that we saw were additions visible from the public right-of-way, the resizing of windows, the replacement of windows and doors, and then also wall cladding alterations. But again, overall, there were not a lot of non-contributors, and the non-contributors that do exist don't detract much from the cohesiveness of the district or its historical significance. So again, we found that View Park meets the National Register of Historic Places criteria for designation as an historic district, and it retains sufficient integrity to convey its significance. So that is all for me. So that being said, I would like to invite everybody up here to take your questions.
Another big round of applause. This really represents a tremendous amount of work in just 3 short months. So congratulations to all for your job. Very well done. Could someone get the mic? Yeah, thanks, Trudy. We'll turn the lights on so you can see. So I'm sure that some of you may have some questions, and the students are here and available to answer any questions you might have about the research that they have presented to you today. In the back.
Well, one of the criteria for the National Register is people, and is that referring to just the architect or the people who live in the home? As in...
That refers to, yes, people who live in the homes.
I mean, like Ray Charles, he wasn't in the East Half, but like Ray Charles' home is up there. There are a lot of famous musicians and African American celebrities.
So in order for, say, a house to be considered significant for its association with an important person, the person has had to have their most significant activities and events occurring at the time that they were living in that house. And so that sort of restricts
And it was in the movie too, the Falcon. Is that how it was? Wasn't it 1965, but maybe it changed the envelope.
No, the simple answer to your question is if you look at the area in which we studied, it was not in there. I don't know. So I don't know if we're going to get to that. There's going to be that second part in the left where
It's in the western part.
pretty much going to recommend that as the second area of investigation.
yeah, that is something that could come in the future.
And because of the scope, remember the scope of our work was sort of limited because it had a limited period of time. So something that we would do in a larger project is look at city directories, who are the people who live in these individual houses. And in the event that we find there was a really large concentration of very significant people, it might also be eligible under criterion B. But that type of research wasn't possible within the scope of our class. Yes?
In your research, did you find the reason why there are these small enclaves of LA City property in the county incorporated area? I don't know who to address that to, but there are a few little odd LA City overlaps to several streets. So I was wondering why that is.
I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, it's going to be outside.
Valley Ridge, for example, has a little sliver of LA City street. If you look at the map, you'll see that one of the maps I showed has these large white areas which are not unincorporated county. It's very odd, I don't know why they're there. They're all
It could have to do with the oil industry. I'm not sure if they were.
I did find that part of View Park was annexed, in that map that Jim had up. There was a certain section of View Park that then was called View Park, and I'm not sure if it's not part of our study area now, why that was parceled out and annexed, and if it's still called View Park today. But I know in the 1930s it was.
For an area to be eligible for national registry, the alterations only have to be visible or not be visible from the public right-of-way. So if someone had made alterations to the back of their house or additions or things that you can't see from the public right-of-way, that would disqualify the area for being eligible. Is that correct?
Correct.
Any question in the back?
Yes, gentleman in the purple shirt. Well, thank you for all the amount of research that you guys did.
Yeah.
But with respect to, originally there were two plans to get city residents out. One was more transit in nature, and the other one had to do with automobiles. In your research, what do you think, based on your opinion, if we would have gone the other route, the $100 million traffic expansion, would View Park have been so exclusive?
In my opinion, it probably wouldn't even hardly exist, at least the way it is, because of how steep the area is. It would be hard for people to walk around. So I don't think it would have expanded in the same manner as it did.
So what exactly does being on this national registry mean? What is the significance of it? What would be benefits? What would be potential negatives to it?
That's really outside the scope of our work. So we didn't go into, what are the community benefits of the National Register? Our work specifically, is this area eligible for the National Register or is it not?
What does it mean if you're on it?
That too is something that we'd like to keep our questions focused specifically to the research presented by the students. And I think that the View Park Conservancy has been really looking into the community benefits of district designation. You can address your questions to them directly. But if we could keep our questions focused specifically on the research that's been presented to you today, that would be appreciated. Thank you. Yes?
I just have a question. Thank you for the information. It's very useful and helpful to understand our community. I've noticed, and most of the residents here have seen kind of the hidden stairwells that run through our neighborhood that connect, and some of them have been closed over or taken over. But I wonder if you saw anything about that in your research. I know you talked about the fact that it wasn't necessary to be pedestrian friendly per se because folks had cars, but there are these stairwells and staircases that run through our community. I just wondered if you found anything on that.
I did not specifically find anything in regards to that and any of the research that I did, but my conjecture would be that that would be an example of ways that they were trying to separate the public from the automobile. Because you still had people walking during this time in the 1920s, and the automobile moves a whole lot faster. So rather than having people walk up these steep hills, use the staircases to separate them, would be my conjecture.
There's another question over here. Or anybody else?
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I have a question. So you looked at a district of 900 buildings, but you actually each only analyzed 105 of that, right? So when you're talking about designating, when you're talking about that this district is eligible, are you basing that on having looked at all 961 of them? Or just on the ones that you looked at? Can you clarify that for everybody?
I believe we're basing that just on the 105 homes that we particularly surveyed. We reached an 86% contributor rate looking at those homes that we analyzed. If you take into account all the rest of the homes in that 900-something parcel area of land to be surveyed, that percentage might go down somewhat, but we do, I think, cohesively believe that there's enough integrity within the streets of View Park and the rest of those homes that it still will be a fairly large percentage overall when you connect all of those homes together.
Again, because of our limited time and because there are only 7 students in this class, we could only look at so many buildings, and we felt that 15 buildings per student was probably a reasonable amount. So we really did it at a microcosm of our study area rather than looking at every single building.
So let's say View Park goes in that 900 and some parcel area, let's say roughly we have 80% contributing homes. In another neighborhood in LA, what might that look like today? How do other neighborhoods differ in contribution and what our neighborhood looks like?
You mean percentage-wise?
Percentage-wise, yeah.
I mean, there's all kinds of historic districts throughout Los Angeles, either districts that are just on the state of California historical register or on the national register of historic places, various levels. I don't think the National Register has a specific percentage, right? So it doesn't have a percentage you have to meet, but typically, don't we say as a rule of thumb, somewhere around 60% in Los Angeles?
In Los Angeles, for local designation, they have an HPOZ program, the Historic Preservation Overlay Zone program. They use a sort of golden rule of 60%, which is not written into their ordinance, but that's something they just use. So there are historic districts that are designated in LA that have a percentage of about 60%. So 86% or whatever the percentage was pretty high. Yes, sir.
Back to what she was speaking on and briefly touched. If you guys identify 105 homes because of the scope of your assignment, that's fine. But as they said, there are 900 homes. You guys identified 105. Am I not mistaken? Out of that 105 was 86%? Correct.
Yes.
So that's a far different number than the entire 900 homes available. The other thing is this. The homes, you guys chose the homes to identify, is that correct?
I chose I randomly selected little clusters and put them into a hat and they picked them out. So it was a completely random process. Thinking,
not personally they chose,
yeah.
but I'm saying out of that 105, were they 105 that of the Spanish?
It was a random selection. That's what I'm saying. Totally random.
It literally was just a parcel map and highlighting random without even looking at them, so we didn't even know what was there.
Exactly.
Well, but if you look at the map, that's not really a very good random distribution. I mean, they're very, very specific parts and very.
Well, I wanted to keep the parcels together so that the students didn't have
Well,
to
I
go.
understand you have very
Yeah.
specific,
right.
operational issues, but it just seems like there's a potential sort of bias there. Because that's really just a very narrow sliver of street compared to the total number. So, if you look at it, that's certainly not a random distribution in terms of individual houses. Of course, you have limited time, limited resources.
Right, I took a map and highlighted in different areas and without looking at the buildings at all. So I didn't know which buildings I was assigning.
Well, I understand, but,
and I then gave them to them. So that was how we, and I wanted it to be a blind process where they didn't know, they would have an experience of discovery when they went out there to find these buildings. Oh, this is what I'm looking at. They had no idea before I gave them their addresses.
Yeah, there's a whole section of like beautiful Asian homes, that were done by some notable architects on the west side.
Mm-hmm.
Again, but Asian influence. But they're really amazing home architecture up there. From the ones that you got, I mean, there's a whole other segment that I think was unrepresented a little bit.
Right, we focused specifically on the earliest part because we knew we couldn't look at everything. We focused specifically on the pre-war section.
Can I make a
Oh,
comment?
sure.
So we did talk about a little bit of what you're talking about in class. And so really we're treating this as a starting point, and hopefully you take it and wherever you go with it is really up to you. But there could be multiple phases that come after. I mean, I had a ranch house in my section. It wasn't all period Bible. So there's lots of opportunity to identify other styles and other themes. And I think you're thinking this is the limit. No, this is the starting point. And so the sky is the limit if you do the research and identify it. And I think that's kind of I think there's a disconnect happening in that area. Yeah.
Did you find any research, just like any kind of books that cover View Park as like a place, architecturally or historically or something like that, that just, captures places in View Park that's already out there?
I don't know anything specific around View Park.
Most of the newspapers.
I've lived in New Park most of my life, and I just want to tell you, I've probably learned more about the neighborhood tonight than I have the entire time. I was in the real estate industry, so I just really want to commend you and thank you for what you brought to us with the 105 homes. With the homes that you did study, is there any additional information? I know we're limited also to a PowerPoint in a few hours, that those of us that are just interested in your research and what else lies under that we can, anybody can find that out, or we can post this and anything like that.
Well, the students uncovered hundreds, probably, of newspaper articles and a lot of really wonderful photographs, and we have them all compiled into a Google Drive, so we can find a way to disseminate all that information to you, so you can all have that at your disposal.
Thank you so much. That's invaluable.
And we'll also, I'm going to compile, so the students, in addition to making this wonderful presentation, have put together a report. So I will also bind the report and give it to you, or send you the link to it, so you can have the report of the findings and their bibliography too.
Thank you so much.
So any last questions? There's some treats left in the back. And, oh, yes.
So I'm just curious, great exercise. What did you learn? I mean, collectively you can answer. What did you learn that you didn't think you would figure out or find out in this exercise? And if you had another 10 weeks, what would you go after that you didn't go after?
Well, I think I could start off by saying we would go after the complete permits, just because, you know, time is limited. But then also, with that same area, if you will, with the permits, really go out and really ask you guys, because we have heard that there were, you know, certain people that had lived in the houses, you know, or were there when it was built. And we also heard that, you know, there was documentation there held by the homeowner in their houses. That kind of stuff would have just been valuable, because it was, you know, that's where we started getting the information of how it was built, why it was built, you know, when the neighbor moved there, you know, that stuff is just is really what we had hoped we would get to the county or cities, because most cities, like that permit process, they have it online. I mean, you just download it right then and there. It was just a little bit more difficult with the process we had to go through.
I think for me personally, something I would have really liked to do if I had the time would be to explore other types of architecture in New York. We looked specifically at period revival architecture, and we looked at a pre-World War II section of the suburb. And just in that area, there were so many other types of styles that I really feel could be explored. And especially if you're looking outside of just the small corner of the real development area in View Park. There's a lot of really wonderful modern architecture, ranch houses, a lot of really great buildings that were constructed before 1965, if that period of significance stays, that really could be considered an important part of Los Angeles history and the history of the community. So I think it'd be really great to take the time to look into those more deeply. If there was, you know, more time.
Well, I'll have to piggyback on Oz. I think the one thing that's lacking in our ability of research is talking to you. There's a whole oral history aspect that was totally not able just because of the limited time. And even to meet with you guys and have, you know, an hour to two just to hear the stories, that's what's really lacking.
And we've heard that, you know, a large number of people like you have lived there for forever. So that would have just been really complete project if we had the time to talk to people in the neighborhood that lived there their entire lives and give us a whole other aspect of the history.
Don't graduate.